and welcome. This is That Shakespeare Life, the channel where we go behind the curtain and into the real life and history of William Shakespeare to explore what it was like to live and work in 15th, 16th, and 17th century England, from 1564 all the way to 1616, primarily with a little bit before and after to give context. If that sounds like fun, then subscribe to the channel because we're here every week. William Shakespeare mentions dogs in his plays numerous times, but there's only one actual dog character in Shakespeare's plays, and that comes from the play Two Gentlemen of Verona, where you see the character of Crab, who is the only dog in Shakespeare's plays. Despite there being only one dog actually in the plays of the Bard, owning a pet was a common occurrence for Shakespeare's England, and you do see Shakespeare's plays mention a wide variety of dog breeds throughout the text of multiple plays. And if you look back at portraits from Shakespeare's lifetime, there are tons of pictures of famous, well, I guess not famous, but noble people with pets that prove that having a pet, owning a pet, and definitely a plush pet who lived a pampered life was a part of life for Shakespeare's England. But did you know that when it comes to feeding these animals, commercial dog food like we think of today didn't actually exist until probably 100 years ago, which means it definitely wasn't around 400 to 500 years ago when people of the 16th and 17th century set out to feed their pets. So what did someone like Shakespeare use for dog food? Let's find out right now on That Shakespeare Life. In the medieval period, dogs were often fed whatever they could scavenge. So remember that dogs were often kept as hunting animals. So they could just go and catch a small bird or a rabbit and have that be their meal. But when they were fed by people, they would often get table scraps. So they would get pieces of meat or bread or things like cabbage or potatoes. Whatever the people were eating, the animals would get some of that too. Now, to be a healthy dog, dogs do have to eat meat. And as far back as 2,000 years ago, people were writing down what they considered recipes for excellent dog food. There's one Roman philosopher named Marcus Terentius Varno. I'm absolutely certain I am pronouncing that wrong, but that's why we provide the spelling. He wrote down that he thought a excellent meal for a dog had to include specifically sheep bones, meat, barley, and bread soaked in milk. A 14th century Count Gaston III wrote a book containing a detailed description of his dog's diet. Now, he owned a greyhound, and he said that his dog needed to eat bread and meat as well, but he also had a special recipe for if his dog became sick, saying that buttered eggs, goat milk, and bean broth were particularly good if the dog wasn't feeling well. The first time we see specifically prepared dog food appear on the scene in history doesn't happen until the 1860s. And if you'd like to know more about how that recipe gets made, our friend Max Miller over at Tasting History with Max Miller actually has an episode where he recreates the 19th century dog food based on the history of dog food. And you can learn more about that there. I'll place a link to his episode in the notes below this video. For Shakespeare's lifetime, pets would have primarily fallen into the table scraps category, with animals being fed food like cabbage, potatoes, bread, and this bits of meat. But some accounts do record that more wealthy animals lived a more posh lifestyle. One French record records that the French court had a chef hired, and his entire purpose in life was to bake bread for the royal pet that lived there in the French court. Clearly, there wasn't a lot of nutritional science that went into the feeding of dogs, but there were no less loved. And obviously, since they were eating what the people ate, apparently giving your dog treats from the table was something that still dates back to hundreds of years ago. They were still doing that. If you're interested in what kind of dog breeds Shakespeare would have known about, you can listen to our podcast episode with Jeff and Shelly Ann Crosby, where we look at Elizabethan dog breeds, including those that are mentioned in Shakespeare's plays. Inside this episode, we not only go over all the different kinds of dog breeds that were popular in Shakespeare's lifetime, but there is also a coordinating history guide for patrons of our show. You can scroll down to the Patreon section on the podcast page, and there is a 22-page history guide into Shakespeare's England that coordinates with episode 159 of the podcast. So you can find links to that as well as the sources for today's episode in case you want to track down the primary documents for that French dog I mentioned. All of that will be in the links below this video. The episode for Elizabethan dogs is CassidyCash.com/episode 159. That's EP 159. You can search our website to find that. That's it for this week. Thank you for watching. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.